Daniel Hayes slammed his toolbox down on the dock so hard the metal rang like a gunshot across the whole yard, and every single man within 50 feet stopped breathing. He didn't shout. He didn't beg. He didn't give that smirking manager the satisfaction of even one angry word. He just picked the box back up, tucked a worn photograph into his shirt pocket, and walked away from the only job he'd held for 11 years. 30 minutes later, 2 United States Navy helicopters descended on that harbor like a reckoning from God himself. And the man who fired him couldn't even speak. What happened in those 30 minutes will change everything you think you know about who gets respected in this country and who deserves to be. If you're watching this from somewhere out there, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. And if stories like this hit home for you, subscribe and ride along, because this one is only getting started. The alarm didn't wake Daniel Hayes on Tuesday morning. He was already awake. He'd been awake since 4:15, sitting at the kitchen table in the house he rented on Garfield Street, drinking black coffee from a mug his daughter Emma had painted for him when she was 7 years old. She was 12 now. The mug was chipped on one side, the handle repaired twice with epoxy, and Daniel wouldn't have traded it for a brand new set from any store on earth. The house was quiet, in the way that only a house with sleeping children can be, that particular silence that presses on a father's chest, equal parts peace and weight. His son Marcus, 14 years old, and already 3 inches taller than Daniel had been at that age, was asleep upstairs. Emma was down the hall, and Daniel sat alone in the kitchen dark, the way he had most mornings for the past 6 years, ever since the morning he woke up and found a note on the counter where his wife used to stand making eggs. He didn't dwell on that. He'd learned not to. What he did think about most mornings was the day ahead. What needed doing, what couldn't wait, what he could control, and what he had to let go. He thought about the Reliant, the Navy vessel that had been dry docked at Hargrove Marine Services for the past 3 weeks. It was a propulsion job, a complicated one, the kind of work that required patience and a specific kind of knowledge that most mechanics in the civilian world simply didn't have. Daniel had that knowledge. He'd spent 8 years acquiring it, first in the U.S. Navy and then in the hard school of real-world application, where mistakes didn't cost you a performance review, they cost lives. He pulled on his work shirt in the dark, buttoned it from the bottom up the way his father had always told him to, and went to check on the kids. Marcus was face down in his pillow, one arm hanging off the bed. Emma was curled tight, her stuffed rabbit still tucked under her chin, at 12 years old, something she would deny to anyone who asked. Daniel stood in each doorway for just a moment, just long enough. Then he went to the garage, picked up his father's toolbox, a battered snap-on chest his dad had carried for 31 years before his hands gave out, and drove to the harbor. He arrived at Hargrove Marine at 5:50 in the morning, same as he did every day, 40 minutes before the official start time. The dock foreman, a thick-necked man named Ruiz, who'd been in the business since before Daniel was born, gave him a nod from the gatehouse. "Cold one today," Ruiz said. "Always is in November," Daniel answered. That was their ritual. Nothing more needed saying. "Some say." The yard smelled the way it always did. Diesel and salt water and rust, and something underneath all of it that Daniel had never been able to name, but had come to think of simply as work. He walked through the equipment shed past the hydraulic lifts and the rack of pressure gauges and the long steel table where blueprints were laid out and argued over, and he made his way down to the dry dock where the Reliant sat under floodlights. She was a Navy Coastal Patrol vessel classified configuration, which meant Daniel was one of only 4 men at Hargrove with the clearance to even work on her. She was 187 feet of government steel, and she had a problem in her starboard propulsion shaft housing that most of the mechanics at the yard couldn't even correctly identify, much less fix. Daniel had identified it in the first 45 minutes of his first inspection. A microfracture in the thrust-bearing housing compounded by what he suspected was a secondary issue in the electronic propulsion control module, a component that the Navy ran on encrypted firmware that required specific military-grade diagnostic tools and a knowledge base that you could only get one way by having served. He pulled on his gloves and went to work. He didn't hear Gary Prentice arrive at 7:20. He was deep inside the propulsion housing running his second diagnostic on the control module when he heard the voice behind him, loud performance, loud the voice of a man who wants an audience more than he wants an answer. Hayes, out, now. Daniel set down his diagnostic tool carefully. He climbed out of the housing, stood up and turned around. Gary Prentice was 34 years old, 1 year younger than Daniel, and he had been the operations manager at Hargrove Marine for exactly 7 weeks. He'd come in from a corporate consulting background, brought in by the new regional ownership group that had acquired Hargrove the previous spring. He had a business degree from a school in Ohio, a very expensive watch, and absolutely no maritime engineering experience. He was also, Daniel had learned in 7 weeks, deeply uncomfortable around men who knew more than he did. Behind Prentice stood most of the morning crew, 8 men at various stations, all of them now watching. Ruiz was among them, his arms crossed, his expression the careful blank of a man who has learned to witness things he cannot stop. "Morning, Gary," Daniel said. "Don't morning me." Prentice held a tablet in his hand, and he turned it like a weapon. "You know what this is? This is the project timeline for the Reliant repair. You know what it says? It says this job was supposed to be completed by last Friday. It is now Tuesday." "I'm aware of the timeline. Are you?" "Because from what I can see, you have been crawling around inside that housing for 3 weeks, like you're looking for buried treasure, and we have a client, a United States Navy client waiting on delivery." "The job isn't done," Daniel said. "The job is past due." "Those aren't the same thing, Gary." Prentice stepped closer. He was doing the thing he always did, positioning himself in the social space, making it physical, making it a performance. "Let me ask you something, Hayes. Do you think your pace of work is acceptable, yes or no?" Daniel looked at him steadily. "I think my pace of work keeps people alive." A sound moved through the watching crew, not a laugh. Something more complicated than that. Prentice's jaw tightened. "That's a very dramatic answer for a man who is significantly behind schedule on a routine repair." "It's not a routine repair. Every repair is routine if you're competent." Daniel felt something move through him, then not anger exactly. Something older and quieter than anger. He'd felt it before in the Navy, the 1 or 2 times he'd been given an order by someone who didn't understand what they were ordering. The feeling of standing at the edge of a decision that can't be taken back. "Gary," he said quietly, "that propulsion control module has a secondary fault in its encryption handshake layer. If I release this vessel with that fault unresolved, and she goes to operational speed in open water, the propulsion system will attempt a safety shutdown, while the encrypted firmware rejects the override command. You'll have a Navy vessel with locked propellers and no manual recovery in open ocean." Prentice stared at him. "That's a different category of problem than a missed deadline," Daniel said. The silence stretched. 3 seconds. 4. Then Prentice said, "I need someone who can deliver on time, not someone who lectures me about categories." "Then you need a different mechanic." "Funny you say that." Prentice turned to face the crew, turned fully, making it clear this was theater, now that he'd planned this, that he'd wanted the audience from the moment he walked in. "As of this morning, Daniel Hayes is relieved of his position at Hargrove Marine Services, effective immediately. Security will escort him out." Nobody moved. Ruiz uncrossed his arms, his hands hung at his sides. Prentice said it again louder. "Effective immediately." Daniel didn't respond to Prentice. He didn't look at Prentice. He turned back to the Reliant, looked at her for a long moment, and then he walked to his workstation and picked up his diagnostic tool. He set it in its case. He closed the case and snapped the latches. He picked up his father's toolbox. Meh. He put his hand in his shirt pocket and felt the photograph his kids at the county fair last August, Emma laughing at something Marcus had said, both of them blurred slightly, because Daniel never could hold the phone still. He turned around and walked through the crew. Nobody stepped in front of him. Nobody said a word until he reached Ruiz, and Ruiz put a hand on his arm just briefly, just a touch, and said very quietly, "I'm sorry, Daniel." "Don't be," Daniel said. "You didn't do it." He walked through the gate. He heard Prentice behind him already talking again, already managing the narrative for the crew. Something about efficiency. Something about the new direction of the company. Daniel kept walking. He drove to a diner on Route 9 called Marcy's. He'd been going there since he was 26 when he first moved to this town after his discharge. The waitress, a woman named Bev, who was somewhere between 60 and ancient, and had never once asked Daniel why he always sat alone, brought him a cup of coffee without his asking. He sat in the booth by the window and looked out at the November street and drank his coffee and held the photograph in both hands. Emma's laugh. Marcus's profile looking at his sister with the particular expression that teenage boys use when they are trying not to show that they love someone. Daniel had not cried in a long time. He didn't cry now. He thought instead about money, about the mortgage, about Emma's dental appointment next week, about Marcus's basketball fees. He thought about his father's toolbox sitting in the seat of his truck, and about his father who had worked 31 years at a steel plant and never once walked off a job that wasn't finished. He took a breath. He thought, what's next? Just think about what's next. He was on his second cup of coffee 28 minutes after he'd walked out of Hargrove Marine when the windows of the diner began to vibrate. Bev looked up from behind the counter. A man in a booth across the room grabbed his coffee mug to steady it. Someone said what the Daniel looked out the window. 2 United States Navy helicopters came in low over Route 9, low enough that the wake of their rotors threw leaves against the diner glass, and they were moving with the purposeful, no-hesitation momentum of aircraft on a military timeline. They were heading in the direction of the harbor. Heading in the direction of Hargrove Marine. Daniel watched them until they passed out of sight. Then he looked down at his coffee. His phone rang. He didn't recognize the number. He answered it. "Mr. Hayes." The voice on the other end was military, not the performed military of movies, but the real thing, flat, efficient carrying authority, the way good tools carry weight. "This is Commander Richard Voss, United States Navy. I need you to tell me exactly where you are right now." Daniel looked out the window where the helicopters had been. "Marcy's Diner," he said. "Route 9. "Don't move," Commander Voss said. "We're coming to you." Daniel set the phone down on the table. He looked at the photograph. He looked at his coffee cup. Bev came over and refilled it without a word. "Thank you," Daniel said. "Honey," she said, looking out the window where the sky was still trembling from the helicopters. "Whatever's happening, it looks like it found you." Daniel picked up his mug. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I think it did." Back at Hargrove Marine, no one was talking about efficiency. Gary Prentice was standing on the dock watching 2 Navy helicopters set down in the service yard with the expression of a man whose entire understanding of the morning had just been removed and replaced with something he hadn't prepared for. Military officers in uniform were stepping out. The lead officer, a commander by his insignia, was speaking to Ruiz, and Ruiz was pointing, and the commander's face was the face of a man receiving information he did not want. "What do you mean he's not here?" the commander said. "He was terminated this morning," Ruiz said. His voice was careful, and entirely without editorializing, which was somehow the most damning tone possible. "About 30 minutes ago." Commander Voss looked at the Reliant, looked at the exposed propulsion housing, looked at the diagnostic equipment that had been left mid-process. "Who made that call?" he said. Ruiz didn't answer. He didn't need to. Half the crew was already looking at Prentice. Prentice straightened up and walked forward, extending a hand. "Gary Prentice, Operations Manager. Commander, I assure you we have a team ready to—" "Mr. Prentice." The commander's voice had the quality of a door closing. "I need Daniel Hayes. I need him here, and I need him now. So tell me, with whatever authority you think you have over this facility, how quickly can you make that happen? Prentice opened his mouth. He had no answer. In the diner on Route 9, Daniel Hayes set down his father's photograph, drank the last of his second cup of coffee, and waited. The story was only just beginning. Commander Richard Voss was not a man who panicked. 22 years in the United States Navy had burned that tendency out of him long before he'd made lieutenant. He had been in situations where the wrong decision meant men didn't come home, and he had learned through fire and repetition and the kind of institutional discipline that doesn't come from a classroom to keep his voice level and his thinking clear when everything around him was going sideways. But standing on the dock at Hargrove Marine Services, looking at an exposed propulsion housing on a classified naval vessel, listening to a civilian operations manager tell him that the only qualified mechanic who had been working on that ship had been fired 30 minutes ago. Richard Voss felt something move through his chest that he hadn't felt in a very long time. It felt a lot like the specific dread of watching a mistake happen in slow motion and realizing you were powerless to stop it before it landed. He turned away from Prentice without another word and pulled out his phone. His second-in-command, Lieutenant Commander Torres, was 3 steps behind him. "Sir?" "Get me everything we have on Daniel Hayes," Voss said. "Service record certifications, the full file, right now." "Already pulled it, sir." Torres held out a tablet. "I ran him the moment dispatch told us the repair wasn't complete." Voss took the tablet and started reading. The first thing that hit him was the length of the file. Most civilian contractor files you could read in 2 minutes. Daniel Hayes's file took considerably longer, and not because of filler. Every line was substance. 8 years of active naval service propulsion systems specialty. 3 commendations. 1 classified operation in which Hayes's diagnostic work on a failing propulsion system had prevented what the incident report described in the dry language of military documentation as a catastrophic loss of vessel and crew. He had been certified in encrypted propulsion control systems, the specific firmware architecture that ran in the Reliance drive system, at a time when fewer than 40 people in the entire naval contractor network held that certification. Voss stopped reading and looked up at the Reliant. Then he looked at Prentice, who was standing 20 feet away, with the expression of a man who was beginning to understand that he had made an error with consequences he hadn't modeled. "Mr. Prentice," Voss said. Prentice walked over. He was still trying to carry himself with authority. He wasn't quite managing it. "Tell me," Voss said, keeping his voice very even, "what your process was this morning. Walk me through it." "We had a significant scheduling overrun," Prentice said. Hayes had been working on this repair for 3 weeks and wasn't delivering on the timeline. In any business environment, when an employee fails to meet performance benchmarks, "This isn't a business environment," Voss said. "This is a federal contract facility servicing classified naval assets. Mr. Hayes wasn't failing to meet a timeline. He was identifying a fault in the propulsion control system that would have resulted in propulsion lockout at operational speed." Prentice blinked. "I wasn't briefed on a secondary fault." "Were you briefed on the nature of the propulsion control system you're contracted to service?" The pause that followed was answer enough. Voss handed the tablet back to Torres. "Get Hayes on the phone. And someone find me a car. I'm going to him." Torres was already dialing. Ruiz, who had been standing quietly at the edge of this conversation, said, "Commander." He said it the way men say a word when they have something important attached to it, and they're waiting for permission to attach it. Voss looked at him. "He's a good man," Ruiz said. "Best I've seen come through this yard in 30 years. Whatever you need him to do, he'll do it right." "I know," Voss said. He did know. The file had told him. "That's why we're going to go get him." The helicopters were faster than the car, but Torres had already made contact by phone, and so by the time the rotors were spinning back up, Voss at least knew that Hayes was stationary, that he was calm, and that he had not. Which was the detail that Voss found most remarkable, asked a single question about why the Navy was calling him. Most men would have asked. Most men would have been defensive or confused or demanding. Hayes had given his location in 4 words and said he'd be there. That told Voss something. They sat down in the parking lot of a diner on Route 9. The rotor wash flattened the landscaping on both sides and drew every face inside the diner to the windows. Voss stepped out before the rotors had fully stopped and pushed through the diner door. He spotted Hayes immediately. There was only one man in the diner who wasn't looking at the helicopters. Daniel Hayes was sitting in a booth by the window, both hands around a coffee mug, looking at a photograph on the table in front of him. He was a compact man, not physically imposing, with the kind of stillness that either came from being very calm or from having expended everything and having nothing left to spend. His work shirt had grease on the left cuff. His father's toolbox was in the seat across from him. Barrier. He looked up when Voss walked in. He didn't stand. He didn't perform surprise. He just looked at Voss with the direct, neutral eyes of a man who had been waiting. "Commander Voss," he said. "Mr. Hayes." Voss slid into the booth across from him, pushing the toolbox over gently. "Thank you for staying put." "Didn't have anywhere pressing to be," Daniel said. "What's the situation with the Reliant?" Voss looked at him for a moment. "You already know. I know what I left unfinished. I know what the consequences of leaving it unfinished are. So yes, what's the situation?" Voss leaned forward. "The vessel is scheduled for an operational deployment in 61 hours. She's carrying equipment that I am not at liberty to discuss in this location, and she needs to be fully operational for a mission that is, let me be direct with you, Mr. Hayes, not optional." Daniel looked at the photograph for just a second. 1 second. Then he looked back at Voss. "The secondary fault in the encryption handshake layer, was it flagged by the onboard diagnostic system after I left, or is it still showing clean?" Voss felt something shift in his assessment of the man across from him, which was already fairly high. Still showing clean to the automated system. That's what makes it dangerous. Because the automated diagnostic doesn't run cross-reference between the firmware handshake and the physical bearing stress tolerances, Daniel said. It reads each subsystem independently. The fault only shows up when you run them in parallel with manual override simulation, which you can only do if you know the fault exists in the first place. He said it the way a man states a fact. No performance, no look at how smart I am. Just the information transferred cleanly. "How long to complete the repair?" Voss said. Daniel was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, calculating. Voss had learned the difference a long time ago. "Depends on what else was touched after I left," Daniel said. "If nothing was disturbed and I have full access and proper equipment, 4 to 6 hours. If someone went in there after me thinking they could speed things up..." He paused. "Longer." "No one touched it," Voss said. "I can guarantee that." "Then 4 to 6 hours." Daniel looked at his coffee mug. "There's something else you need to know." "Tell me." "The repair requires a manual override sequence on the encrypted firmware. That's not a civilian procedure. You need someone with active military propulsion credentials and the specific cipher keys for this class of vessel. I still have my credentials, but my cipher key access was suspended when I transitioned to civilian contracting." He met Voss's eyes. "You'll need to reinstate it." Voss held his gaze. "I can do that. Then I'll need it reinstated before I go near the control module." "Understood." Voss put both hands flat on the table. "Mr. Hayes, I want to offer you something before we go any further. I'm not asking you to go back to work for Hargrove Marine Services. What I'm offering is a direct federal contract independent between you and the Department of the Navy outside of Hargrove's chain of command entirely. Full authority over the repair process safety standards timeline. Your terms." Daniel Hayes looked at him for a long moment. Outside the diner window, the helicopter rotors turned slowly in the November wind. "What about after?" Daniel said. "When the Reliant's fixed and she's deployed." "That depends on how this goes," Voss said. "But I'll tell you honestly, there are people in my chain of command who've been looking for civilian contractors with your specific certification profile for over 2 years. If this repair goes the way your file suggests it will, the conversation about after will be a different kind of conversation than this one." The waitress Bev came over without being called and refilled Daniel's coffee. She looked at Voss briefly with the frank appraisal of a woman who has been reading customers for 40 years And whatever she concluded, she kept it to herself. She left. Daniel picked up the photograph from the table and held it for just a moment, not sentimentally, not in a way that asked for anything from Voss. Just the gesture of a man who checks in with the thing that matters most before he commits to the thing that matters next. He put the photograph in his shirt pocket. He picked up his coffee mug and finished what was in it. He said, "All right, Commander, let's go." They came in over the harbor, and Daniel watched through the helicopter window as the scope of the problem resolved below him. The Reliant sat in dry dock, exactly as he'd left her propulsion housing exposed diagnostic equipment, arrayed around the access points. A line of men standing well back from the vessel, with the particular posture of people who know that something is wrong, and know equally well that there is nothing they can do about it. Then he saw Prentice. The operations manager was standing on the dock with two men Daniel didn't recognize, corporate from their coats, from the way they were positioned, slightly behind Prentice, as if to signal that whatever happened next, it was his decision, his problem. Prentice was watching the helicopter come in with an expression that Daniel, even from altitude, could read without difficulty. It was the expression of a man recalculating. Daniel looked away. He wasn't interested in Prentice's recalculation. He was interested in the Reliant and in the specific concrete problem inside her, and in the fact that he had 61 hours, now closer to 59, before a naval crew was going to need her to function at full operational capacity. The helicopter touched down in the service yard and Daniel stepped out. But the entire crew was there. Every man who had been on the dock that morning when Prentice fired him was standing somewhere in his line of sight. He could feel the weight of their attention, not hostile, not exactly, but charged. They were watching to see what he was going to do. He walked straight toward the Reliant. He did not look at Prentice. He did not slow down. He heard Prentice's voice from his left. "Hayes. Hayes, I want to." And he kept walking. Ruiz fell into step beside him, half a pace back. "Diagnostic equipment is exactly where you left it," Ruiz said quietly. "I made sure." "Good man," Daniel said. The control module access panel, Prentice had one of the junior guys open it around 10 this morning. I sent him away before he touched anything. Daniel stopped walking for exactly one step, then continued. "Who?" "Kid named Ortega. He didn't know what he was looking at. I don't think he touched the module itself. I'll check." Daniel reached the Reliant and set his toolbox down at the base of the access ladder. He opened it, looked at his tools, his father's tools. 30 years of chosen instruments for specific purposes, and began to pull what he needed. Torres appeared at his shoulder. "Mr. Hayes, Commander Voss is working on the cipher key reinstatement. ETA on that authorization is approximately 20 minutes. "That's fine," Daniel said. "I've got other work to do first. Tell him I'll be in the propulsion housing." Merci. He pulled on his gloves. He looked up at the vessel above him, at the steel and the exposed workings, and the problem he knew was inside her, the problem he had identified and named, and been fired for taking the time to fix. He felt underneath the professional focus something that was partly anger, and partly something cleaner. The feeling that a man gets when he is exactly where his skills belong, doing exactly the work he was built to do, and nothing, not a manager's wounded ego, not a corporate timeline, not the audience of 60 men watching from the dock, nothing is going to stop him from doing it right. He climbed the ladder and went to work. The first hour was assessment. Methodical, thorough, undramatic from the outside. Daniel moved through the propulsion housing with the efficiency of someone who has mapped a space so thoroughly in his mind that his hands know where to go before his eyes confirm it. He checked every point he had already verified. He identified what Ortega had touched the access panel latch, nothing else. Ruiz had gotten there in time, and he rebuilt his mental model of the system's current state. And the secondary fault was exactly where he had left it. Dormant in the handshake layer, invisible to automated diagnostics, waiting with the patience of a physical law. For the moment when the propulsion system hit full operational load, and the encrypted firmware attempted to handshake with the bearing stress monitor and found a reply that was 17 milliseconds too slow. 17 milliseconds. In most systems, that would mean nothing. Wow. In this system at operational speed in open water, it would trigger a safety lockout that the encrypted firmware would then prevent from being overridden by any standard procedure. The vessel would go dead in the water. The crew would be unable to restore propulsion without a manual override that required the cipher key and the specific procedural knowledge of the system's architecture. Daniel had both. He was the only person within 400 miles who had both. He understood with a clarity that had nothing to do with pride why the Navy had sent helicopters. Torres appeared at the access point. "Mr. Hayes, cipher key authorization has been reinstated. Commander Voss sends it through the secure terminal. Lieutenant Park has it ready for you at Station 3 when you're ready. Tell Commander Voss I'll be at Station 3 in 11 minutes. Torres disappeared. Daniel finished his pre-authorization assessment, documented 3 specific measurements in his notebook, the notebook his daughter had given him last Christmas, the one with the blue cover, and climbed back out to Station 3. Lieutenant Park, a young officer with the careful manner of someone who is very aware that they are observing something important, handed him the secure authorization token. Daniel entered the cipher credentials. The system acknowledged. He went back into the housing. The moment the first real complication surfaced, it was 40 minutes into the authorized repair work, and it was worse than Daniel had estimated. He was running the parallel diagnostic, the manual cross-reference between the firmware handshake and the bearing stress monitor, when a second fault surfaced in the data. Not the fault he'd identified. A different fault, deeper in the power distribution node that fed the propulsion control module. He stopped. He looked at the data for 60 seconds, reading it the way a doctor reads an unexpected scan result, not panicking, not dismissing, but sitting with it long enough to understand what it was telling him. Then he climbed out of the housing and found Commander Voss. "We have a second problem," he said. The dock went quiet around them. Not silent machinery still ran harbor sounds, still existed, but the specific human noise of the shipyard dropped in a way that told Daniel everyone in earshot had stopped their secondary activities and was listening. Voss's expression didn't change. "Tell me, there's a fault in the power distribution node for the propulsion control module. It's not related to the primary fault. This one looks like it's been developing for longer. Weeks maybe. The automated system flagged it twice in the maintenance logs, and the flag was cleared both times without investigation." Voss said very quietly, "Cleared by whom?" "The maintenance log shows an operations authorization. I don't have access to the personnel records, so I can't tell you the name." Daniel paused. "But the flag was cleared on October 14th and again on October 29th. Torres, who had been standing just behind Voss, pulled out his tablet and began moving quickly. "Can you fix both?" Voss asked. "Yes," Daniel said, "but not in 4 to 6 hours. This is an 8 to 10 hour job now minimum." Voss absorbed this. He looked at his watch. He looked at the Reliant. He made the calculation. Daniel could see him making it between timeline pressure and operational necessity, and he made it the way a good commander makes difficult calculations without flinching and without pretending the math was different than it was. "What do you need?" Voss said. "Time and no interference," Daniel said. "And I need Ruiz." "Ruiz. He's the only other man here who can assist on the physical side without me having to stop and explain what I'm doing. He's not cleared for the encrypted systems, but he can handle everything else." Voss looked at Ruiz, who was standing 10 feet away, pretending he hadn't heard everything. "Ruiz," Voss said. "Sir," Ruiz said. "You're working with Mr. Hayes for the duration, whatever he needs." "Yes, sir." Ruiz said it without any elaboration, but Daniel caught in the older man's face something that looked like relief, like a man who had been standing on the sidelines of a wrong thing and had finally been given something right to do. Daniel nodded at him. Get me the T9 housing wrench and the secondary pressure gauge from Equipment Bay 2. And coffee. A lot of it. Ruiz almost smiled. You got it. Daniel pulled his gloves back on and turned toward the ladder. Behind him, he heard a voice, Prentice trying one more time. Commander, if there's anything the Hargrove team can... Mr. Prentice. Voss's voice was very quiet, very final. I'm going to ask you to step back from the vessel and remain available. An investigative team will want to speak with you about the maintenance log authorizations on October 14th and 29th. The dock went very still. Daniel climbed the ladder and went back to work. 6 hours later, the service yard was transformed without having physically changed at all. The same dock, the same machinery, the same gray November sky. But the energy of the place had shifted the way the energy of a room shifts when the person who controls it has changed. Daniel had not stopped working except once to consult with Torres about a technical specification detail, once to eat half of a sandwich that Bev the waitress from Marcy's Diner had apparently sent over with a delivery driver, because someone had told someone who had told her, and this was the kind of town where that was a thing that happened. Ruiz had been at his side for all 6 hours, handing tools and holding components, and not saying one unnecessary word, which was exactly what Daniel needed, and which Ruiz somehow understood without being told. The crew watched in shifts. Men would drift over watch for 20 minutes, drift away. Some of them Daniel knew had never seen this kind of repair work up close. The real kind. The kind where the margin for error was measured in milliseconds and the stakes were measured in lives. They were watching a thing that most people never get to see, a man operating at the absolute ceiling of his capability under pressure without breaking. Marcus called at 3 in the afternoon. Daniel took the call for 90 seconds. Hey, buddy. Dad, why is there a video on TikTok of a Navy helicopter landing at your job? I'll explain tonight. How was school? Dad? How was school, Marcus? A pause. Fine. Mrs. Cardelli gave me a B+ on the history thing. That's good? That's real good. I'll see you at 6. He hung up and went back to work.
Dancy Sunday.
At 4:47 in the afternoon, 9 hours and 11 minutes after Daniel Hayes had been handed a federal contract in a diner on Route 9, and approximately 10 hours and 20 minutes after Gary Prentice had fired him in front of the entire crew. Daniel climbed out of the propulsion housing for the last time, pulled off his gloves, and looked at Commander Voss. She's ready, he said. Voss looked at him. Both faults resolved. Power distribution node replaced. Encryption handshake recalibrated and tested at simulated operational load. Bearing stress tolerances verified manually at 4 separate load settings. Daniel paused. She'll run better than she did before she came in. The dock was very quiet. Then Ruiz, who was standing right behind Daniel, and who had said very little in 9 hours, said in a voice that was rough around the edges in a way that it hadn't been that morning. Damn right she will. Commander Richard Voss, United States Navy, looked at Daniel Hayes for a long moment. Then he stood straight, and he brought his right hand up, and he rendered a full, formal salute to the civilian mechanic standing in front of him, with grease on his shirt and his father's toolbox at his feet. Daniel didn't salute back. He was a civilian. It wasn't his to give. But he nodded once with the dignity of a man who has earned what he's been given. Behind Voss, the crew watched. All of them. Including Gary Prentice, who was standing at the far edge of the dock with the 2 corporate men and who had not in 10 hours found a single thing to say. Daniel picked up his toolbox. He looked at the Reliant one last time, the ship that had been his problem and his responsibility and his proof. He put the photograph back in his shirt pocket. I'll have my written report to your office by Friday, he said to Voss. If there's nothing else, Commander, I need to get home. My kids need dinner. Voss almost smiled. It was a small thing, barely visible. Go home, Mr. Hayes, he said. We'll talk Friday. Daniel walked off the dock. The crew parted for him the way people part for someone whose authority has nothing to do with a title or a badge or a corporate org chart. The authority that comes from being without argument or performance, the best person in the room, at the thing that mattered most when it mattered most. He walked through the gate. He got in his truck. He drove home to feed his kids. Daniel made spaghetti that night. It wasn't a deliberate choice. It was just what was in the cabinet, and his hands knew how to do it without his brain having to participate, which was exactly what he needed after 10 hours inside a propulsion housing. He stood at the stove and stirred the sauce and listened to Marcus in the living room, doing something loud with his basketball against the hardwood floor, and Emma at the kitchen table behind him telling him about a girl at school who had said something unfair about her science project and the ordinary noise of it. The completely unremarkable, beautiful, everyday noise of his house with his children in it settled around him like something he hadn't known he'd been holding his breath for. "Dad," Emma said partway through her account of the science project injustice. "Are you listening? Megan copied your color coding system and didn't give you credit, and Mrs. Patterson gave you both the same grade," Daniel said without turning from the stove. A pause. "Yeah. That's not fair. It really isn't." "Did you tell Mrs. Patterson?" "I didn't want to be a snitch." Daniel turned around and looked at his daughter, 12 years old, his wife's eyes, his mother's stubbornness. "There's a difference," he said, "between being a snitch and telling the truth when the truth matters. One of them protects you. The other one just lets the wrong thing keep happening." Emma considered this with the serious expression she'd been deploying since she was 4. "Is that what happened at your work today? You told the truth when it mattered?" Daniel turned back to the stove. "Something like that," he said. Marcus came in from the living room, sock-footed and ducking under the doorframe because he'd had to start doing that 3 months ago and still hadn't entirely gotten used to it. "Dad, seriously, there's like 47 comments on that TikTok video asking who the mechanic is. One of them says you're a hero. Another one says you're a Navy SEAL." "I was never a Navy SEAL." "I know that I'm just—" "Wash your hands. Dinner's ready." Marcus opened his mouth, decided against whatever he was going to say, and went to wash his hands. Emma helped Daniel set the table without being asked. They ate together in the kitchen with the overhead light on and the window showing the dark November street outside, and Daniel answered his children's questions, the ones they actually asked, which were simpler than the ones they were thinking. And when Marcus asked very carefully, "So are you going to have a job?" Daniel said, "Yes, a better one," and left it there, and somehow that was enough. After dinner, he sat at the table and wrote his preliminary field notes for the Reliant repair. His personal notes, not the official report, the ones he kept in the blue notebook, the ones that said what actually happened and why and what it meant for the long-term health of the vessel's systems. He wrote for an hour. He drank one more cup of coffee. He checked on both kids and stood in each doorway the way he always did. Then he went to bed and slept for 7.5 hours without moving. He woke up at 4:15, same as always. The call started at 6:50 in the morning. The first one was from a number he didn't recognize with a Virginia area code. He let it go to voicemail. The message was from a man named Calloway, who identified himself as working in procurement for the Department of Defense, and who said in the measured tone of someone reading from a prepared statement that he'd been made aware of the work Daniel had performed at Hargrove Marine, and was interested in discussing potential contract opportunities. The second call came at 7:03, different number, same Virginia area code. By 7:30, he had 6 voicemails from numbers he didn't recognize. He was standing in the driveway watching Marcus back down the street toward the school bus stop, something Marcus insisted on doing alone. Now, a 14-year-old's declaration of autonomy that Daniel respected, even though part of him would have walked him to the corner until the kid was 30 when his phone rang with a number he did recognize. It was Torres. "Mr. Hayes, good morning. Commander Voss asked me to call ahead before reaching out himself. He wanted to give you a heads up." "About what?" "About the fact that the preliminary report from last night's repair has been reviewed at the command level, and about the fact that the maintenance log authorization investigation has surfaced some findings that are moving quickly." Torres paused in the way that people pause when they're deciding how much to say. "Mr. Hayes, are you available to speak with the commander at 9 o'clock this morning?" Daniel looked at his watch. "I'll be home." "He'll call you at 9. Daniel went inside and poured his second cup of coffee and sat down at the kitchen table. His phone rang again. Virginia area code. He turned it face down and drank his coffee. At 9 o'clock exactly, Voss called. "I'll skip the preamble," Voss said, which Daniel appreciated. "The maintenance log investigation found what we suspected. The fault flags in the Reliance power distribution node were cleared both times by a single authorization, and that authorization traces back to a corporate directive to reduce flagged maintenance items before the quarterly performance review." Daniel set down his coffee mug, very carefully. "They cleared safety flags for a performance review." "Yes." "On a classified naval vessel?" "Yes." "No." He didn't say anything for a moment. He was thinking about the power distribution node, about what it had looked like when he'd gotten in there, the specific signature of a fault that had been developing for weeks, the way the connections had been stressed. He was thinking about what would have happened if the Reliant had deployed on schedule. If Prentice had succeeded in pushing the repair through on his timeline, or replaced Daniel with someone faster and less qualified, and the vessel had gone to operational speed in open water with both faults active. He was thinking about a crew. "How many people on the Reliance operational manifest?" he said. Voss answered quietly. 23. Daniel breathed. "The investigation is being handled at a level above my direct involvement now," Voss said. "I wanted you to know because your repair documentation, the field notes you submitted last night, have become part of the evidentiary record. Your identification of both faults with timestamps is significant." "I keep thorough notes," Daniel said. "I know, I've read them." A pause. "They're very thorough, Mr. Hayes. My father taught me that if you do a job, you document it the way you'd want someone else to document it for you someday," Daniel said. Voss was quiet for a moment. "He sounds like a smart man." He was. Another pause. The comfortable kind, the kind between two people who understand each other well enough to let a silence exist. "The contract," Voss said. "I have an offer prepared. It's a 12-month independent contractor agreement, federal rate, full safety authority on any vessel you're assigned to. No corporate intermediary. You report to me directly on technical matters." He said the number. Daniel's hand tightened on the phone. The number was more than he had made in the last 2 years combined. He said evenly, "That's a serious offer." "It's a serious skill set," Voss said. "And Mr. Hayes, there are other conversations ahead of this one from agencies I'm not at liberty to name right now who have been made aware of your file. I wanted you to have this offer in hand first because I wanted you to have options, not pressure." Daniel looked at the blue notebook on the table, at his father's toolbox on the floor by the door, at the photograph of his kids that was sitting by the toaster because he'd taken it out of his shirt pocket last night and set it there without thinking. "I'll have my answer by Friday," he said, "when I bring the full report." "Friday," Voss confirmed. "I'll be here." The call from Hargrove Marine came at 11:17, not from Prentice. From above Prentice, a man named Garfield, who was apparently the regional director of the ownership group that had acquired Hargrove the previous spring. His voice was the voice of a man accustomed to being the most important person in any conversation he entered. "Mr. Hayes, I want to personally apologize for the circumstances of your departure yesterday. What happened was completely inconsistent with Hargrove's values and our commitment to—" "Mr. Garfield," Daniel said. "Yes. What do you want?" A brief recalibration on the other end of the line. "We'd like to offer you your position back, with significant improvements to your compensation and title, effective immediately." "What's the number?" Garfield said it. It was a 40% raise over what Daniel had been making. Daniel had the federal contract offer still open on the table in front of him with Voss's number written in his own handwriting. "I appreciate the call," Daniel said. "I'll think about it." He hung up and did not think about it. What he did think about sitting at that kitchen table on a Wednesday morning was the question Emma had asked him over the spaghetti the night before. About telling the truth when it matters. About the difference between protecting yourself and letting the wrong thing keep happening. He thought about Ruiz, who had been at the yard for 30 years and who had no federal contract offer, waiting no. Virginia area codes filling up his voicemail, no commander who knew his file, who had stood at the edge of every wrong thing that had happened at Hargrove and witnessed it with his arms crossed and his hands empty. He called Ruiz at 11:30. "You hear from anybody this morning?" Daniel asked. Hargrove called, Garfield himself. Ruiz's voice had a dry quality that hadn't been there yesterday. "Told me my performance over the last 24 hours had been exemplary, and they wanted tours had been exemplary, and they wanted to discuss a senior foreman position." "What did you say?" "I said I'd think about it." A pause. "Same thing you said, I imagine." Daniel almost laughed. It came out more like a breath. "Yeah, Daniel." Ruiz's voice changed. Dropped the dry quality, became direct. "The guys in the yard, the crew, they want to talk to you. Not officially, nothing like that. They just want to talk." "About what?" "About how things are, about whether things are going to change. They trust you. That's not a small thing." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "Tell them I'll come by the yard on Friday, after I meet with Voss." "I'll tell them. Ruiz, you did good yesterday, keeping Ortega away from the housing, watching the equipment." "I've been watching things go wrong in that yard for 2 years," Ruiz said. "I was tired of watching." "I know," Daniel said. "I'll see you Friday." The story broke publicly on Thursday afternoon. Bye. Daniel didn't release anything. He didn't call a reporter, didn't post anything, didn't do anything except live his life for 36 hours after the repair, take his kids to school, write his report, eat dinner, sleep. The story found its own way out, the way these things do, through the permeable membrane of a shipyard full of people who had witnessed something and who had phones in their pockets. By Thursday afternoon, the broad outlines were on 3 different news sites. A decorated Navy veteran and single father fired from his civilian mechanic job for being too thorough, called back by military helicopter when the vessel he'd been working on turned out to be unrepairable by anyone else. The maintenance log investigation hadn't been reported yet, that would come later, but the human story, the bones of it, was already out. Daniel's phone became unusable around 3 in the afternoon. He gave it to Emma to manage, which she did with the focused efficiency of a 12-year-old who has grown up understanding that competence is a form of love. She created a filter, identified the calls that seemed legitimate, and presented him with a list of 6 numbers to return and a note that said in her handwriting, "These seem real. The rest are probably journalists or weirdos. Love, E." He kept the note. He put it next to the photograph by the toaster. He returned 2 of the 6 calls that evening. One to a Maritime Engineering Association that wanted to discuss a speaking engagement, which he declined politely, and one to a woman named Dr. Sandra Okafor, who identified herself as a Federal Safety Compliance Director and who wanted to discuss in detail the specific nature of the maintenance log authorization process at Hargrove Marine. That conversation lasted 45 minutes. Daniel was very thorough. He had his blue notebook in front of him the whole time. When it was over, Dr. Okafor said, "Mr. Hayes, I want to be direct with you. What you've described, the specific pattern of flag clearances, the authorization structure, the timeline, this isn't an isolated incident. This is a systemic practice, and what you documented in your field notes is the clearest evidence we've had of it." "What happens now?" Daniel said. "An investigation," she said. "A real one. Not a performance review, not a corporate audit. A federal safety investigation of contracted naval maintenance facilities across 3 states." Daniel thought about 23 people on an operational manifest. "Good," he said. "We'll need your cooperation." "You have it," he said. "Send me whatever you need."
Dancers?
He hung up and sat in the quiet kitchen for a while. The house was still. Both kids were asleep. The overnight seemed to be the only time the noise of the last 48 hours fully retreated and left him alone with himself. He thought about his father, about the toolbox, about the 31 years his father had carried it without once cutting a corner on a job. Even when cutting corners would have been easier, even when no one would have known, because the kind of man his father was didn't require an audience to maintain his standards. Daniel had tried to be that kind of man. Sometimes it had cost him. He looked at the photograph. For 23 people on a ship, it had also possibly been the difference. Friday arrived the way important days do, completely ordinary on the surface, carrying everything underneath. Daniel drove to the federal building where Voss had set up his temporary command office, arriving 8 minutes early with his full written report in a manila envelope and the blue notebook in his jacket pocket. Torres met him at the entrance and walked him up. Voss was at a table with 2 other officers Daniel hadn't met, and the meeting lasted 2 hours and 15 minutes. They went through every line of the repair documentation. They asked specific technical questions, the kind that told Daniel these were people who understood what they were asking. He answered every question, directly correcting 2 minor errors in his own initial report that he'd caught in the rewrite, which seemed to please Voss in a way that was visible only in the slight relaxation around his eyes. At the end, Voss slid the contract across the table. Daniel read every word of it. He took 11 minutes. No one rushed him. He signed it. Voss extended his hand, and Daniel shook it, and that was the business portion of the meeting clean and complete. Then Voss said, "There's something else." He slid a second document across the table. This one had a different header, not Navy procurement, but something above it, an agency designation that Daniel recognized from his service years. "This is preliminary," Voss said. "But they've asked me to put it in front of you, a standing consultation role. Classified vessels, propulsion systems, safety protocol review. You'd work with 6 different agencies over the course of a year. Travel required but manageable." Daniel looked at the document for a long moment. "My kids," he said. "The travel schedule is flexible," Voss said. "They built it with flexibility as a requirement. I told them about your situation." He paused. "I hope that was all right." Daniel looked at him. "Why would you do that?" Voss held his gaze. "Because the best people always have something that matters more than the job, and the organizations that forget that always lose the best people." He said it quietly, like a man who had seen the pattern enough times to have an opinion about it. "I didn't want you lost." Daniel looked at the document again. He thought about the 4:15 mornings and the chipped coffee mug and the school bus stop and Emma's serious expression and Marcus ducking under door frames and the photograph that lived in his shirt pocket. He thought about his father's toolbox. He said, "I'll need to talk to my kids." "Of course," Voss said. "I'll have my answer Monday." He took both documents, the signed contract and the preliminary consultation offer, and put them in the manila envelope with his report. He picked up his jacket. He shook hands with the 2 officers he hadn't met. He nodded at Torres. At the door, he stopped. "Commander," he said. Voss looked at him. "The maintenance log investigation. Hargrove. Whatever comes out of that, make sure the crew is protected, the men on the floor. They weren't the ones clearing flags." "I know," Voss said. "They won't be the ones who answer for it." Daniel nodded. He went through the door. The Hargrove Marine Yard at 2 in the afternoon on a Friday had the particular quality of a place that knows something is about to change and is holding very still while it decides what it thinks about that. 31 men were gathered in the equipment shed when Daniel arrived. Not summoned formally, Ruiz had just told them, and they had come. The full crew, plus 3 men from the second shift who had driven in on their off day. Men Daniel had worked beside for years, some of them for all 11 years, some of them more recently. Men who had stood on the dock 2 days ago and watched him walk out carrying his father's toolbox and a photograph of his children. None of them had stopped him. He understood that. He held no grievance about it. A man in Gary Prentice's position in Gary Prentice's yard with Gary Prentice's authority and your mortgage and your kids' tuition and the specific economic reality of a coastal working-class town. Daniel understood every calculation those men had made on that dock because he had made versions of those calculations himself for 11 years. He stood at the front of the shed and looked at them, and they looked at him, and for a moment, nobody said anything. Then a man named Cabrera, who had been at Hargrove for 16 years and who had the particular credibility of longevity, said, "You coming back?" "No," Daniel said. "Not as an employee." The shed absorbed this. "But I'm going to be around," Daniel said. "I've signed a federal contract independent. I'll be working on vessels at this facility as a contractor, which means I'll be in this yard, and I'll have federal safety authority over any repair I'm assigned to, which means certain things that have been happening here are not going to keep happening." Cabrera said, "The log clearances." "You knew about those," Daniel said. "We knew something was wrong," Cabrera said. "We didn't know exactly what. Prentice would come down, flag would disappear, job would move forward. We thought—" He stopped. "We thought somebody above us had checked it out and decided it was fine." "Nobody checked it out," Daniel said. "The flags were cleared to make the quarterly numbers look cleaner. That's it." The silence in the shed was the specific silence of men who suspected something bad and have just had it confirmed. "What happens to the yard?" another man asked. "Someone near the back." "That depends on what comes out of the investigation," Daniel said. "But I'll tell you what I told Commander Voss. The men in this yard aren't the ones who should answer for this. You did your jobs. Somebody above you didn't do theirs." He let that land. Then he said, "I'm also going to be starting something, an apprenticeship program, Navy-certified proper credentials, real training on encrypted propulsion systems. Something that gives the young mechanics in this yard a path that doesn't depend on some corporate manager deciding whether your skill set is worth keeping." He paused. "Ruiz is going to help me run it." Every head in the shed turned to Ruiz, who was standing against the wall with his arms crossed, and who, for the first time in Daniel's memory, looked slightly uncomfortable with attention. "He doesn't know that yet," Daniel added. Ruiz uncrossed his arms. He looked at Daniel with an expression that was equal parts exasperation and something that was trying very hard not to be moved. "You could have asked," he said. "I'm asking now," Daniel said. "A beat." "Yeah," Ruiz said. "All right." Something loosened in the shed. Not celebration, these were not men who celebrated easily, but the particular release of tension that comes when a group of people who have been under sustained low-grade pressure for a long time are told that someone with both the ability and the will to do something about it is going to do something about it. Cabrera said, "What about Prentice?" Daniel said, "I don't know. That's above my level." He paused. "But I'll tell you this, the investigation is federal, not internal. So whatever accountability looks like, it's not going to be determined by the same people who hired him." That was enough. He didn't stay long after that. He shook hands. He talked to a few men individually. He listened more than he spoke. When he left the yard at 3:40, he drove home the same route he had driven to work every morning for 11 years past. The water past the marina, past the place on Route 9, where Marcy's Diner sat with its parking lot half full and its window looking out at the street. He thought about sitting in that window 2 days ago, holding his coffee mug, watching the helicopter rotors move in the November wind. He thought about Voss saying, "I didn't want you lost." He drove home. Emma was at the kitchen table doing homework. Marcus was in the living room this time, actually reading, which was a thing he pretended to do less than he actually did because he was 14 and reading wasn't the image he was managing. Daniel stood in the doorway between the kitchen and living room for a moment, looking at both of them, his two completely unremarkable and entirely extraordinary children. "Hey," Marcus said without looking up from his book. "Hey, buddy, there's a thing on the news about you." "I know." "Is it mostly right?" Daniel thought about 23 people on an operational manifest. about his father's toolbox, about 11 years of 4:15 mornings, about the specific 17-millisecond fault that nobody else would have found. "Mostly," he said. Emma looked up from her homework. "Dad, are you okay?" He looked at his daughter. "Yeah," he said. "I really am." He went to make dinner. He talked to his kids on Sunday night. Not at dinner. Dinner was its own thing, with its own rhythms and its own rules. And Daniel had always believed that important conversations deserved their own space, not squeezed between passing the salt and clearing the plates. He waited until after dinner, until Marcus had finished the dishes, without being asked, which was either personal growth or a sign that the 14-year-old had already sensed something significant was coming, and Emma had put away her homework and settled on the couch with her rabbit, which she was holding without the usual defensive posture of a 12-year-old caught being 12. Daniel sat in the armchair across from both of them and put the two documents on the coffee table. He didn't explain what they were first. He just put them there and let his children see them and said, "I need to talk to you about what happens next." Marcus looked at the documents, then at his father. "Is this about the job?" "Yes." "The new one?" "Both of them, actually." Emma leaned forward and looked at the papers with the focused attention she brought to everything she considered worth her time. "There are two jobs. There's a federal contract that one's already signed, and there's a second offer, a consultation role. That one I haven't decided on yet because it involves some travel, and before I decide anything that affects this family, I talk to this family." He looked at both of them. "That's how it works." Marcus was quiet for a moment. He had the particular stillness he'd been developing in the last year, something that was moving away from boy stillness, which was just the absence of motion toward man stillness, which was thought. Daniel noticed it and felt, as he often did lately, the simultaneous pride and grief of watching his son grow up. "How much travel?" Marcus said. "Manageable, flexible schedule, but not zero." "Like school events, would you be there?" "I would make every school event a condition of the agreement," Daniel said. "In writing, before I sign." Marcus looked at him. "You can do that. I can ask for it. If they say no, I'll know what the job is really worth to them." Emma said, "What does the consultation thing actually do? Like, what would you be working on?" Daniel thought about how to explain classified naval propulsion systems to a 12-year-old in a way that was honest without being either condescending or dangerously specific. "Safety," he said finally. "I'd be checking the safety of ships, making sure the people who work on them and sail on them are protected by people who know what they're doing, not just people who are trying to make their numbers look good." Emma absorbed this. She looked at the photograph on the coffee table. She'd moved it from the kitchen earlier in the week without saying anything, placing it more centrally in the way that children sometimes silently rearrange things to assert that they matter. "Is that why they fired you?" she said. "Because you were making the numbers look bad?" Daniel looked at his daughter for a long moment. "Yeah," he said. "Essentially." "That's stupid." "Yes, it is." "Are they in trouble now?" "Yes." Emma sat back against the couch cushion, with the expression of someone who has received a verdict they consider just. Marcus was still looking at the documents on the table. "Dad," Marcus said, "take both jobs." Daniel looked at him. "I can handle things here when you travel. I'm not 8. He said it without bravado, just factually, with the straightforwardness of a 14-year-old who has been watching his father handle things alone for 6 years and has been quietly preparing for his own turn. "Emma and I are fine. We've always been fine." Emma said, "He's right. We're fine. Take the jobs, Dad." Daniel looked at his two children, the 12-year-old with her rabbit and her serious eyes, and the 14-year-old who was already ducking under door frames and talking like someone who understood consequences, and he felt the specific weight of a moment that would not repeat itself. A moment that was both an ending and a beginning. A moment that his father's ghost would have recognized from the inside. He said, "All right." He picked up the second document from the coffee table, All right, he said again quieter. I'll call them Monday. He called Voss Monday at 8 in the morning. Both, he said when Voss answered. I'll take both. But I need the travel schedule flexibility in writing, and I need final safety authority in language that's clear enough that a corporate manager can't reinterpret it later. I anticipated that, Voss said. Torres has a revised draft ready. Check your email. Daniel checked his email. The revised draft was already there, time-stamped 6:52 that morning. He read it at the kitchen table with his first cup of coffee. The language was in fact exactly as clear as he'd asked for, cleaner even than he'd expected. Final Safety Determination Authority, non-delegable in plain English. He called Voss back at 8:22. It's good, he said. I'll sign it today. Good, Voss said. There's one more thing. Can you be available Wednesday afternoon 2 o'clock? The Federal Building, same conference room. What's Wednesday? Dr. Okafor's team has completed the preliminary phase of the investigation. They want to present findings before they go public. They've asked that you be present. Daniel set down his coffee mug. How bad is it? Voss was quiet for 1 second, which was itself an answer. Wednesday at 2, Daniel said. Wednesday at 2, Voss confirmed. The 2 days between Monday and Wednesday moved with the contradictory pace of important waiting. Slow on the surface, fast underneath the way time moves. When you know something is coming and you're not entirely sure what shape it's going to have when it arrives. Daniel signed the consultation agreement Monday afternoon. He took Emma to her dental appointment Tuesday morning. Clean bill of health. No cavities. The hygienist told Emma she had excellent technique, which Emma received with the solemnity of a professional receiving peer recognition. He drove Marcus to basketball practice Tuesday evening and sat in the gym for 40 minutes, watching his son move through drills with the particular grace of a kid who is starting to understand his own body. And he thought about nothing in particular, which was a specific kind of rest he'd learned to accept. Tuesday night, Garfield from Hargrove called again. Daniel answered this time. Mr. Hayes, I want to have a real conversation with you, not just about your position, but about the direction of the facility. Garfield's voice had changed. Since the first call, the practiced authority was still there, but underneath it was something that sounded like a man who had received news he wasn't prepared for. I think there are changes that need to happen, and I think you're someone who could be part of shaping those changes. What kind of changes? Daniel said. Safety protocols, management structure, the way maintenance authorizations are handled. What specifically is changing? A pause. We're committed to a full review of Mr. Garfield. Daniel kept his voice level. I've been working in this industry for a long time. I know the difference between a company that's committing to change because it believes in change, and a company that's committing to change because federal investigators have subpoenaed its maintenance records. In silence on the line. I'm not saying the changes aren't real, Daniel said. I'm saying that real change in a culture like the one that existed at Hargrove Marine doesn't come from a phone call to the man you fired. It comes from a sustained, uncomfortable, years-long process of doing things right when doing things right costs you something. He paused. I hope you do it. I mean that. There are 31 good men in that yard who deserve to work somewhere that doesn't put them in the position of choosing between their conscience and their paycheck, Garfield said quietly. Is there nothing I can offer you? You can make the yard better, Daniel said. That's what you can offer, not me, the men who stayed. He hung up. He sat in the kitchen for a while. He thought about the offer. He thought about the years of driving to that dock at 5:50 in the morning, the ritual of it, the belonging of it, the way a place can become part of your identity without your realizing it until the identity is challenged. Vital. He thought about walking out with his father's toolbox. He thought about 2 Navy helicopters. He thought no. The answer is still no. He went to bed. Wednesday at 2 o'clock, Daniel sat in the federal conference room and listened to Dr. Sandra Okafor present findings that he had suspected, but whose full scope he had not anticipated. The investigation had found systematic maintenance flag clearances at not one, but 4 contracted naval repair facilities. Hargrove Marine was one of them. The practice had been in place at varying levels of sophistication for between 18 months and 3 years, depending on the facility. The pattern was consistent flag surfaces. Flag is reviewed by operations manager. Flag is cleared to protect quarterly performance metrics. Work proceeds, vessel is returned to service. In at least 2 documented cases, vessels had been returned to service with unresolved faults that were subsequently repaired at sea under emergency conditions. In one of those cases, the repair had required diverting the vessel and cost the Navy 11 days of operational capacity. In the other, the fault had resolved itself through luck, through the specific tolerances of that vessel's system, through the kind of good fortune that is not a safety protocol. 23 people on the Reliance operational manifest had been, by the most conservative analysis in the report, operating in a vessel that would have experienced propulsion lockout within the first 4 hours of sustained operational deployment. The room was very quiet while Okafor presented this. Daniel looked at the table. He was thinking about his father. About a thing his father used to say, which was that the only difference between a mistake and a crime is whether you knew better at the time. Everybody involved in clearing those maintenance flags had known better. They'd had the flags themselves as evidence that something needed attention. They had chosen with full information to clear them. That was not a mistake. Okafor finished her presentation and looked at Daniel. Mr. Hayes, your documentation, the field notes, the repair report, the time-stamped fault identification. These have given the investigation something we almost never get in cases like this. A clear, technically credible record created in real time by someone with the specific expertise to understand what they were documenting. She paused. Without your notes, this investigation would have taken significantly longer to establish the pattern with the specificity required for federal prosecution. Daniel said, "Is it going to prosecution?" "Yes," she said. "At a minimum for Hargrove. Possibly for 2 of the other facilities as well, depending on how the next phase of review resolves." Daniel nodded. He thought about Prentice. He didn't feel satisfaction about it. He'd examined that feeling carefully enough over the past several days to know that what he felt was closer to sorrow. Not for Prentice specifically, but for the particular human phenomenon of someone so focused on a narrow metric of success that they couldn't see the actual stakes of what they were managing. Prentice wasn't a villain in the movie sense. He was something more ordinary and more dangerous. A man who had never been required to understand the consequences of what he was overseeing, and who had therefore never developed that understanding, and who had therefore made decisions with outcomes he genuinely hadn't modeled, because the modeling had never been demanded of him. That was the real problem, not Prentice. The system that produced Prentice and put him in charge of things that required a different kind of knowledge than he had, and never noticed the gap. Mr. Hayes. Voss, who had been sitting at the end of the table through the presentation, spoke now. "There's something the investigation team would like to ask of you in addition to the documentation you've already provided." Daniel looked at him. "There's going to be a congressional briefing, the Oversight Committee for Naval Contractor Safety. They want a technical witness, someone who can explain in plain language what a maintenance flag actually means, why it exists, what happens when it's cleared without investigation. Someone who can make 23 people on an operational manifest reel to a room full of legislators who understand budgets better than they understand propulsion systems." Daniel was quiet. "You don't have to," Voss said. "Everything you've already done has been more than—" "When?" Daniel said. Voss told him the date. It was 6 weeks out. "Marcus has a basketball tournament that weekend," Daniel said. Torres, who had learned in 4 days to anticipate this particular variable, said, "The briefing is scheduled for Thursday. The tournament is Saturday." Daniel looked at Torres. "I checked," Torres said without apology. Daniel almost smiled. "All right," he said. "I'll do the briefing." The call from Gary Prentice came on Thursday morning, and it was the last call Daniel had been expecting. He almost didn't answer. The number was Prentice's personal cell. Daniel had it from years of work communication and hadn't deleted it, which he supposed said something about him, though he wasn't sure what. He looked at it for 3 rings. He answered. "Daniel." Prentice's voice was completely different from every version of it Daniel had heard in 7 weeks of the man's tenure at Hargrove. All the performance was gone. What was left was a voice that sounded genuinely hollowed out. I don't even know why I'm calling. I don't have any right to." Daniel didn't say anything. "I wanted to say I'm sorry. I know what it doesn't do. I know what the investigation found. I know what I signed off on." A breath. "I didn't know what the flags meant. I genuinely didn't know what I was clearing. That's not an excuse. I'm not trying to walk away from it. But I need you to know that I didn't know anyone could get hurt." Daniel held the phone and looked at the photograph by the toaster. He thought about what he'd thought in the conference room 2 days ago, about the system that produces people like Prentice, about the gap between what a man is asked to manage and what he is equipped to understand. He said, "I believe you." Silence on the line. "I believe you didn't know," Daniel said. "And I need you to understand that that's not the comfort you might think it is. 23 people were at risk because you didn't know. That's the whole problem. Not that you were malicious, but that you were in charge of something you didn't understand, and you didn't know enough to know what you didn't understand, and nobody in the chain above you required you to know." He paused. "That system is what the investigation is actually about. You're part of it, but you're not all of it." Prentice said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "What do I do?" "Tell the investigators everything. Every authorization, every conversation, every directive you received from Garfield's group about performance metrics and flag clearances. All of it." Daniel's voice was level. Not kind exactly, but not cruel either. Just direct. "The only thing that's worth anything at this point is the truth given fully without managing it. And after, I don't know what after looks like for you," Daniel said. "That's not mine to say." He paused. "But I'll tell you this, whatever you do next, make sure it's something you actually understand, that's all. Just make sure you understand what you're responsible for." He hung up. He sat for a while. Then he picked up the blue notebook and wrote down the date and the call the way he documented everything. Not because he expected to need it, but because his father had taught him that a man who keeps records is a man who takes his own actions seriously enough to stand behind them. He closed the notebook. He got up and made his second cup of coffee. The weeks that followed had a different texture than any period of Daniel's life since before his discharge. Not easier, not harder, but more layered. The federal contract work was real and demanding, and deeply satisfying in the way that work only is when it asks everything from you and you have everything to give. He drove to Hargrove 3 days a week, worked on vessels in his specific capacity, and exercised his safety authority twice in the first 2 weeks, once stopping a repair that was being rushed past a step that required more cure time than the schedule allowed, and once flagging a diagnostic result that the crew had been about to wave through because it was within the automated system's tolerance range. And Daniel knew from the specific combination of readings that the automated range was wrong for that vessel's age and operating conditions. And both times he was listened to. The first time he was listened to because of the contract language. The second time he was listened to because of the first time. That was how authority actually worked in Daniel's experience. Not from a title, not from a contract, but from the repeated demonstration of being right when it mattered until the demonstration accumulated into something that people trusted without having to remind themselves to trust it. Ruiz started the apprenticeship program curriculum with Daniel on their off hours. Ruiz's dining room table on Tuesday evenings, a 6-pack of something cold between them, and a stack of technical manuals that Ruiz kept making fun of and reading carefully. They were building something real from scratch, the way real things are built slowly with argument and revision and the occasional acknowledgement that the other person was right about something. This section on encrypted firmware. Ruiz said one Tuesday evening, tapping the manual with one thick finger. "You're going to lose the apprentices right here. It reads like a legal document." "It is essentially a legal document," Daniel said. "So translate it. Into English. Into the kind of English that a 22-year-old who's good with his hands but didn't go to college is going to be able to use." Daniel looked at the section. He looked at Ruiz. "That's going to take me 2 weeks to rewrite." "Then it'll take 2 weeks." Ruiz took a drink. "The program's not starting until February anyway." Daniel rewrote the section. It took 11 days. The congressional briefing came on a Thursday in the middle of it all, and Daniel drove to Washington the night before, so he wouldn't have to rush in the morning. He'd booked a modest hotel room near the Federal Building, and he'd brought the blue notebook, and he'd sat at the small desk and gone through his notes until he knew them so well they felt like his own breathing. He testified for 2 hours and 14 minutes. He did not use jargon. He did not perform expertise. He spoke to the committee the same way he spoke to Marcus, when Marcus asked how something worked directly with respect for the listener's intelligence and no patience for unnecessary complication. He explained what a maintenance flag was. He explained what it meant when one appeared. He explained with a specific timeline and a specific fault description what happened when a flag on the Reliant had been cleared without investigation. He explained what 23 people would have experienced in specific and non-euphemistic terms if the propulsion lockout had occurred at operational speed in open water. The room was very quiet. A senator from a coastal state, a man who had the look of someone who had spent a lot of his life near water, said, "Mr. Hayes, in your professional assessment, is this an isolated failure or a systemic one?" Daniel said, "Senator, the specific fault I repaired was on one vessel. The practice that allowed the fault to go unaddressed is on every vessel serviced by a contractor whose performance is measured by metrics that don't include safety outcomes. That practice is not isolated. What would fix it?" Daniel had thought about this. He had thought about it the way he thought about propulsion faults, following the chain of causation back to the source, identifying where the system was actually failing rather than where the symptom appeared. "Independent safety authority," he said. "Technical oversight that is not employed by, managed by, or evaluated by the entity it's overseeing. The same way a quality inspector at a manufacturing plant shouldn't report to the production manager. Safety and efficiency are not naturally opposed, but the moment you ask the same person to optimize for both, safety loses because safety costs time in the short term, and efficiency saves money in the short term. And short-term metrics are what most corporate structures actually reward." And the senator wrote something down. "You'd stake your professional reputation on that assessment," he said. "Senator," Daniel said, "I staked my professional reputation on it when I refused to rush the Reliant repair. I'm still here, the vessel is operational, and 23 people went home to their families." He drove back that same evening because Marcus had practice Friday morning and Daniel had promised to watch. 3 weeks after the congressional briefing, Garfield announced the restructuring of Hargrove Marine Services. New Safety Department independent reporting structure, third-party audit requirement. The press release described it as a proactive commitment to excellence, which was the language corporations use when they are responding to federal pressure, and would prefer the public to believe they arrived there voluntarily. Daniel read the press release. He neither endorsed nor condemned it publicly. What he did on the same afternoon it was released was send an email to Dr. Okafor and to Voss and to the 2 other officers he'd met in the conference room during the investigation presentation. The email said simply, "The structural changes are real if and only if the people implementing them understand what they're implementing. I'm available to consult on the technical training requirements if that would be useful." All 4 responded within 2 hours. He realized no longer someone asking permission to do useful work. He was someone being asked to do it. That was a different kind of life than the one he'd been living. Not easier, in many ways harder, because harder things were being asked of him, but different in the way that a thing fits differently when it's the right size. He came home that Friday evening to find Emma had made dinner. Not a complicated dinner pasta the same way he made it, because she'd been watching him do it for years. but real dinner on the table with the plates set and a glass of water at each place, and Marcus was already sitting down, looking at his phone and pretending he hadn't been waiting. "You made dinner," Daniel said. "You were late," Emma said, "and we were hungry, so." He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment. He looked at his daughter, who had made dinner because she was practical and capable and had been learning from him for 12 years how to handle things. He looked at his son, who was pretending to be on his phone, but who had set the table, which was a thing Daniel could tell because the napkins were folded wrong in the way Marcus always folded them. He thought about the photograph in his shirt pocket. He thought about a Tuesday morning 3 weeks ago, when he had slammed his toolbox down on a dock and walked away from the wrong version of his life. He sat down at the table. "Tell me about your day," he said. And they did.
Dickon and we.
The night before the basketball tournament, Daniel sat at the kitchen table late after both kids were asleep, and he opened the blue notebook to a clean page. He did this sometimes, not every night, but when something felt like it needed marking, like it existed at a threshold between what had been and what was going to be. He wrote the date at the top of the page. He wrote, "The Reliant is operational. The crew is safe. The program starts in February. Marcus plays tomorrow." He looked at what he'd written for a while. Then he wrote one more line the way his father used to end his own notes, the practice Daniel had inherited along with the toolbox. Did the job right. Signed it with his initials. He closed the notebook. He put the photograph of his kids, the one from the county fair. Emma laughing. Marcus pretending not to face up on the table next to his coffee mug, the way he did every morning. He went to check on his children. He stood in each doorway. Just long enough. Then he went to bed and slept, and in the morning he woke up at 4:15 the same as always and made his coffee and sat in the kitchen quiet and waited for the day to begin. Marcus's team won the tournament on Saturday. Not easily. The final game went to overtime, and for 4 minutes of that overtime, Daniel stood with both hands in his jacket pockets and said nothing, watching his son play with the particular intensity of a 14-year-old who has decided somewhere in the second half that losing is not acceptable. Marcus scored 7 of his team's last 9 points. The final basket was a driving layup that drew a foul, and Marcus stood at the free throw line with the gym noise pressing in from all sides, and put both shots through clean, and the gym erupted, and Daniel exhaled for what felt like the first time in 4 minutes. Emma, sitting next to him in the bleachers, said, "I knew he was going to do that." "Did you?" Daniel said. "He always gets quiet right before he does something good. You do the same thing." Daniel looked at his daughter. "You both get this face," she said, demonstrating a slight compression of the jaw, a settling of the eyes. "Like you're turning everything else off." Daniel thought about the Reliant, about the moment he'd climbed into the propulsion housing for the last authorized pass, knowing exactly what he was going to find and exactly what he was going to do about it. "Huh," he said. Emma looked pleased with herself. "You didn't know you did that, did you?" "No," he admitted. "I did not." Marcus found them after the handshake line, still breathing hard, his jersey dark with sweat, holding the tournament bracket that someone had given him and that he was pretending to be casual about while visibly not being casual about it. He looked at his father, and Daniel looked at him, and something passed between them that didn't require language, the particular communication between a father and a son at a moment of the son's achievement, which is not entirely about basketball, and not entirely about anything else either. Daniel put a hand on the back of Marcus's neck the way his own father used to do. "Good game, buddy," he said. Marcus nodded once, jaw tight, managing his face. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, it was." Shame. They drove home. Emma talked the entire way. Marcus looked out the window and smiled at it when he thought no one was watching. Daniel drove and listened to both of them and thought that if someone had told him 6 weeks ago that the worst morning of his professional life would lead to this particular Saturday afternoon, this truck, these kids, this feeling of things being genuinely okay, he would have wanted to believe it and wouldn't quite have managed it. He believed it now. The apprenticeship program launched the first Tuesday of February, and it launched with 11 people. Daniel had expected 6. He and Ruiz had planned the curriculum for 6, designed the workshop schedule for 6, ordered materials for 6. But word had moved through the yard, and then beyond the yard, in the way that word moves in working-class communities, where people are connected not by LinkedIn, but by the actual knowledge of who knows what and who can be trusted. And by the morning of the first session, there were 11 men in the equipment shed at Hargrove Marine, ranging in age from 19 to 41, looking at Daniel with the specific attention of people who have decided that this is worth their time and are reserving final judgment on whether they were right. Ruiz stood at the back with his arms crossed and his expression carefully neutral, which Daniel had learned to read as his version of excited. Daniel looked at the 11 men. He thought about the first day of his Navy propulsion training 20 years ago, sitting in a classroom at a naval facility with 40 other enlisted men listening to a chief petty officer explain that the next 8 weeks would be the hardest technical education most of them had ever attempted, and that the ones who made it through would carry a skill set that would matter for the rest of their lives. He remembered thinking at 22 that the chief was overselling it for motivational effect, and he had not been overselling it. "I'm not going to tell you this is easy," Daniel said to the 11 men. "I'm not going to tell you it's fast. What I'm going to tell you is that when you finish this program, you're going to be able to walk onto any vessel at this facility and know with certainty whether that vessel is safe to return to service. Not what the automated system thinks. Not what the timeline says. What is actually physically, mechanically true." He paused. That kind of knowledge is not replaceable by a spreadsheet. It's not replaceable by a performance metric. It's yours, and once you have it, nobody can take it. The youngest man in the room, the 19-year-old whose name was Dario, and who had been working at Hargrove for 8 months as a general laborer, said, "What if the manager doesn't listen? What if you tell them something's wrong and they clear it anyway?" The room got quiet. Daniel looked at Dario for a moment. "You document it," he said. "Every time. You write down the date, the fault, what you said, who you said it to, what happened next. You keep that record in a place that isn't their filing system. And if the day comes when you need it..." He picked up the blue notebook from the workbench and held it briefly. "You'll have it." Dario looked at the notebook. He nodded slowly, the nod of someone storing information in a place deeper than short-term memory. "Any other questions before we start?" Daniel said. Nobody had any other questions. They started. The first twist nobody had predicted came 6 weeks into the program, and it came from outside the yard entirely. Daniel was at home on a Thursday evening working through the rewrite of the 3rd curriculum module, the one on electronic fault cascade sequences, which was the section Ruiz kept insisting needed more plain language, and which Daniel was increasingly convinced Ruiz was right about when his phone rang with a number he recognized as the agency designation from the consultation agreement. Not Voss's direct line, a different number higher. He answered. The man on the other end introduced himself as Deputy Director Halbrook. He spoke with the particular economy of someone whose time is genuinely limited and who has learned to transmit information with minimal friction. "Mr. Hayes, I'll be direct. The congressional briefing you gave last month has generated significant interest at several levels. The Oversight Committee is moving forward with a proposed reform package for naval contractor safety standards. They've asked us to identify someone to serve as a civilian technical advisor to the drafting process." Daniel said nothing. "Your name was submitted by Commander Voss and independently by Dr. Okafor and by 2 members of the committee staff," Halbrook said. 3 independent submissions for the same name is uncommon enough that it got my attention. "What would the role involve?" Daniel said. "Reviewing proposed regulatory language for technical accuracy, identifying gaps between what the legislation intends and what is actually achievable in a practical maintenance environment, translating between the policy world and the operational world." A pause. "Essentially the same thing you did in the briefing, but in a sustained capacity over a 4 to 6 month drafting period." Daniel thought about the blue notebook, about the 11 men in the equipment shed, about the 11 modules of curriculum he was still working through about Dario and his question about what to do when the manager doesn't listen. "I have commitments I can't walk away from," he said. "The apprenticeship program I'm running, my federal contract work, my family. We're not asking you to walk away from any of them," Halbrook said. "This would be concurrent. Remote where possible travel when necessary. We're asking for your brain and your experience, not your calendar." Daniel said, "Send me the scope in writing." "It'll be in your inbox in 20 minutes. It was in his inbox in 14. He read it at the kitchen table, then read it again more slowly, then called Ruiz. "What would you say?" Daniel said when Ruiz picked up. "If I told you I might need you to carry more of the program for the next few months?" Ruiz was quiet for exactly 1 second. "I'd say I've been doing half of it already, and you just haven't noticed." Daniel almost laughed. "That's not true." "It's mostly true." A pause. "What's going on?" Daniel told him. Ruiz was quiet for longer this time. A genuine silence, the kind that meant he was actually thinking rather than waiting for a turn to speak. "Daniel," he said finally, "how many people could that regulation protect if it gets written right?" Daniel had thought about this. He had in fact run a rough calculation in his head while reading the scope document based on what he knew about the number of contracted naval maintenance facilities and the number of vessels they serviced annually. Thousands, he said, over time. If the language is right and the enforcement is real. "Then you have to do it," Ruiz said. "The curriculum's in good shape. Dario's already helping me with the younger guy's kid catches on fast. We'll be fine." A beat. "Daniel, do it." Daniel looked at the scope document on his screen. He thought about his father, who had once been offered a foreman position at the steel plant and turned it down because he didn't want to stop doing the actual work. Daniel had always admired that decision. He had also, in recent weeks, begun to understand that there was more than one way to do the actual work, that shaping the conditions in which other men worked was also a form of the work, maybe the deeper form, the one that multiplied itself. "Okay," he said. "I'll call them tomorrow." "Good," Ruiz said. "Now let me finish my dinner." He called Emma in from the living room that night because Emma was the person in the house whose judgment he trusted most when he needed to think something through out loud, and he'd stopped apologizing to himself for that being true. She sat across from him at the kitchen table and listened while he explained the new role. She asked 3 questions: what it paid, how much travel, and whether it would affect the spring semester school schedule. He answered all 3. She thought about it for 40 seconds, which he timed because he'd learned that Emma's thought pauses had a shape to them, and 40 seconds was her working through something pause, different from her already decided pause, which was 15. "Do it," she said. "Obviously. Marcus is going to be in the thick of his basketball season." "Dad, Marcus and I survived 6 years with one parent working full-time in a physically demanding job that occasionally required emergency overtime on a Navy vessel." She said this with the absolutely straight face of a 12-year-old who has fully inherited her father's gift for delivering a statement that is also an argument. "We can handle you being on a Zoom call." Daniel looked at his daughter. "When did you figure out what I actually do for a living?" he said. "I've known since I was 9, she said. "You fix the engines on Navy ships so they don't break in the middle of the ocean and people die." That's... He stopped. "That's essentially correct." "I know." She got up from the table. "Call them in the morning, Dad. I'm going to finish my homework." She left the kitchen. Daniel sat alone at the table and felt the specific feeling of being known by the people who matter, not the broad public knowledge that had attached itself to his name in the weeks since the Reliant story broke the news sites and the TikTok videos and the Virginia area codes filling up his voicemail. But the close-range knowledge of the people who lived with him, who had been watching him for years, who could identify the look on his face, he didn't know he had. That kind of knowledge was a different category of thing entirely. It was the category that sustained a man through the mornings before it was light out. The category that made the hard decisions feel less lonely. He called the agency in the morning. The regulatory drafting process began in March, and it was in Daniel's experience the most painstaking work he had ever done, more demanding in some ways than the Reliant repair. Because with the Reliant repair, the problem and its solution were ultimately physical concrete, bounded by the laws of mechanics and electricity. Regulatory language operated in a different medium, one where the enemy was ambiguity, and the weapon was precision, and the stakes of getting it wrong were diffuse, spread across time and geography, measured not in one vessel's propulsion system, but in every contracted facility that would operate under the rules being written. He was on 3 calls a week minimum with the drafting team, a group that included 2 legislative staffers. Dr. Okafor, a retired admiral named Carver, who had the manner of a man who had been patient his entire career and had earned the right to be very direct now, and a maritime attorney named Bellamy, who asked the kind of questions that initially seemed basic and turned out to be the most important ones in the room. In the first week, Daniel corrected a fundamental error in the proposed fault flag language. The draft had defined a maintenance flag as resolved when it was cleared in the system. Daniel pointed out in writing, and then on the call, that this was precisely the mechanism that had allowed the Hargrove pattern to exist. A flag that was cleared in the system without physical resolution was indistinguishable in the proposed language from a flag that was cleared because the underlying fault had been properly addressed. The silence on the call after he explained this had a specific quality to it. Bellamy said, "So the entire first section needs to be restructured?" "Yes," Daniel said. "How long will that take?" "Depends on how we define resolution. If you want language that is technically enforceable and cannot be gamed by a manager with system access, I can draft it. It'll take me about a week." Admiral Carver said draft it. Daniel drafted it. It took 9 days. When Bellamy reviewed it, she said on the record in the call that it was the clearest technical regulatory language she had reviewed in 14 years of maritime law practice. Daniel wrote the date in the blue notebook. Nothing else, just the date and the page number the way he always marked things that mattered. The second major twist came in April, and it came from a direction Daniel genuinely had not seen. Dario came to see him. Not at the yard at Daniel's house on a Saturday morning, which meant the kid had looked up his address or asked Ruiz for it, either of which suggested a degree of intentionality that Daniel took seriously. Dario was 20 now, having had a birthday in March, and he had changed in the 2 months since the program started in ways that were specific and visible, not louder, not more confident in the performed sense, but more grounded, the way a person gets when they start to understand what they're capable of. He stood on Daniel's porch and said without preamble, "I want to join the Navy." Daniel looked at him. "Because of the program," he said. "Because of the program. Because of what you've been talking about. Because I keep thinking about you said once that the knowledge is yours and nobody can take it. And I keep thinking, where do you go to get more of it, like the real version? And the answer keeps being the same place." Daniel opened the door wider. "Come in, I'll make coffee."
Ocean Mississippi.
They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Daniel had sat with Commander Voss in his head on a Tuesday morning that felt like a different lifetime, and Daniel asked Dario specific questions, the real ones, not the recruitment ones. About his family, about what he was willing to leave behind, about what he understood about the commitment he was describing. Dario answered all of them seriously, and without performing seriousness, which was the distinction Daniel had learned to look for. Then Daniel said, "Why are you asking me and not just going to a recruiter?" Dario looked at him steadily. "Because I want to know if you think I can actually do it. Not if I'm eligible. If I can do it." Daniel looked at the 19-20-year-old across his kitchen table. He thought about what he'd seen in the past 2 months. The way Dario absorbed technical information and then applied it not by following steps, but by understanding principles, which was the much rarer thing. The way he'd started helping the younger men without being asked. The question he'd asked on the first day about what you do when the manager doesn't listen. "Yes," Daniel said. "I think you can do it." Dario exhaled. "I'll write you a recommendation letter," Daniel said. "A real one, not a form." "You'd do that." "You came to my house on a Saturday morning to ask me a serious question," Daniel said. "The least I can do is give you a serious answer in writing." He wrote the letter that afternoon. 3 pages, single-spaced, specific. He sent it to Dario and kept a copy in the blue notebook folder. He heard later from Ruiz, who heard from someone at the yard, that the recruiting officer who received the letter had called Dario to ask how he knew Daniel Hayes. Dario had apparently said simply, "He's my instructor." The recruiting officer had apparently said that in 15 years he had not received a recommendation letter written with that level of technical specificity and personal assessment. Dario was accepted into naval training 8 weeks later. Daniel heard the news on a Tuesday evening and sat with it for a while, turning it over. He felt something that was not quite pride. Pride was something you felt about your own achievements, and this wasn't his achievement, this was Dario's. What he felt was something closer to rightness, the feeling of a chain extending. His father's knowledge to him, his knowledge to this program to Dario, to wherever Dario was going to go and whatever he was going to carry. The toolbox handed forward. By May, the apprenticeship program had a waiting list. Sabur Sobi. Not a long one. Daniel wasn't scaling it faster than the quality could hold, which was a decision he'd made deliberately, and which Ruiz enforced with the particular authority of a man who has watched too many good things get diluted by growing too fast. But the list existed, which meant the program had a reputation, which meant something had been built that was larger than the 2 men who had built it. 3 maritime companies had reached out about licensing the curriculum. Daniel had said no to all 3, not because the idea was wrong, but because the timing wasn't right. The curriculum was still being refined, and you didn't license an unfinished thing and let other people finish it for you in directions you couldn't see. He told Ruiz this over the phone one evening, and Ruiz said, "You know, for someone who works with machines, you think about quality control in a very human way." "Machines and people fail the same way," Daniel said. "You rush the process, you skip a step, and the fault shows up later when the stakes are higher." Ruiz was quiet for a moment. "You should say that at the program, on the first day, that exact thing." Daniel wrote it in the blue notebook. He said it the following February to the second cohort, which had 14 people. The regulatory reform package was signed in June, not with fanfare, not with cameras, the kind of legislative action that gets 2 sentences in trade publications and 0 coverage on television. But that will, over the next decade, change the material conditions of how contracted naval maintenance facilities operate across the country. Daniel was not in the room when it was signed. He was at Hargrove Marine inside a propulsion housing on a different vessel, running a manual diagnostic on a bearing stress configuration that the automated system had flagged, and then under the new regulatory language could not be cleared without a qualified technical review. Torres called him when the signing was confirmed. Daniel said good. He was holding a diagnostic tool and his hands were dirty, and he was 40 feet inside the vessel, and the signal was bad. "That's all you have to say," Torres said. "What else would I say?" "I don't know, something more I thought you'd be." Torres. Daniel adjusted his grip on the diagnostic tool. "I've got a fault to finish diagnosing. Tell Commander Voss congratulations from me." He hung up and went back to work. He told Ruiz about it that evening, and Ruiz said, "So it's done." "The first part," Daniel said. "The legislation is the blueprint. The enforcement is the building. The building takes longer." "Will you be part of that?" "Some of it, where I can actually help." He thought about it. "The same way I've been doing it from inside the work, not above it." Ruiz said, "Your father would have liked that." Daniel didn't answer for a moment. "Yeah," he said quietly. I think he would have. The moment that closed the year, not the official end of anything, not a ceremony or a signing or a tribunal verdict, but the moment that Daniel would remember as the one that put a period at the end of the sentence, came on a Friday evening in late June. He had finished his contract work for the day. He was in the parking lot at Hargrove, putting his father's toolbox in the back of his truck when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned around. It was Cabrera, the 16-year man. He was still in his work shirt end of the day. He walked up to Daniel with the unhurried pace of someone who has something specific to say and has already decided to say it. "I want you to know something," Cabrera said. Daniel waited. "When Prentice fired you, that morning." Cabrera looked at him directly, the eye contact of a man who has rehearsed this and decided not to flinch from it. "I could have said something. I had enough seniority. I could have told him he was making a mistake, and I didn't. I just watched you leave." "I know," Daniel said. "I've been sitting with that for 7 months." "I know that too," Daniel said. "I should have said something." Daniel looked at him. At the 16-year man who had stood with his arms at his sides on a Tuesday morning and made the calculation that every person makes at some point between conscience and consequence, and had landed on the wrong side of it and had known it ever since. "Cabrera," he said, "you know why I kept thorough notes?" Cabrera shook his head. "Because my father told me that a man who documents his work is a man who trusts that the work matters enough to stand behind it. He said it's easy to do good work when somebody's watching. The discipline is doing it when nobody's watching, knowing that the record is the witness." Daniel closed the tailgate of his truck. "You've been your own witness for 7 months. That's not a small thing." Cabrera said nothing. "The question isn't what you did that morning," Daniel said. "The question is what you do tomorrow, and the next day. When you see a flag get cleared too fast, when you see a younger guy about to let something go because the manager's leaning on him, what you do then. That's the record." Cabrera stood with this for a moment. Then he said, "Dario told me you wrote him a 3-page letter." "He asked a serious question," Daniel said. "I've got a nephew," Cabrera said. 21. Good with his hands, good instincts. He's been looking for something to train in." Daniel said, "Program starts again in February. Send him to Ruiz." Cabrera nodded. He put out his hand. Daniel shook it. He drove home. Marcus had grown another ½ inch since February, which meant he was now 6 feet and 1/2 inch tall at 14 years old, a fact that he mentioned approximately twice a week, and that Emma had begun greeting with audible sighing. The household had its own weather, its own seasons, its own recurring patterns. Marcus pushing, and Emma observing, and Daniel holding the frame around both of them, steady enough that they could push against it without it moving. That was the job. The real one. The one that had been there longer than any contract or any vessel. Yeah. He made dinner that Friday simple, the same pasta Emma had made the night Marcus won the tournament, which had become a kind of household reference point. A meal that meant something without anyone having explicitly decided it meant something. They ate at the kitchen table, with the window showing the June evening outside, and Daniel listened to his children talk about their week, the way he always listened, fully present, not planning his response, not managing the conversation toward a conclusion, just listening. Emma said at one point, "Dad, are you happy?" The question landed cleanly the way Emma's questions always did. No build-up, no warning, no softening. Just the question, sitting in the middle of the table next to the pasta, and the water glasses asking to be answered honestly. Daniel looked at his daughter. He thought about 4:15 in the morning and black coffee and the weight of a sleeping house. He thought about his father's toolbox and the blue notebook and the Reliance propulsion housing and 17 milliseconds and 23 people. He thought about Dario and Cabrera and Ruiz and Voss. He thought about a Tuesday morning that had felt like an ending and had turned out to be a beginning that he hadn't been able to see from inside the ending. He thought about this table, these two people. "Yeah," he said, "I really am." Emma studied him the way she always studied him, with the specific diagnostic attention of someone who is checking the answer against the face that's giving it. She decided it was true. "Good," she said, and went back to her dinner. Marcus said, without looking up from his pasta, "Can we get a dog?" "No," Daniel said. "What if it was a small dog?" "Still no." "What if Emma asked?" Emma said, "I'm not asking." Marcus sighed. "You're both so difficult." Daniel looked at his son. His 14-year-old son, who was 6 feet tall and made game-winning layups and folded napkins wrong and still looked out the car window at things he was moved by when he thought no one was watching.
Madame?
He felt something settle in him, something that had been unsettled for a long time, since long before the Tuesday morning at the harbor, since longer than he usually let himself trace it, something that had been moving and was now simply still. Not because everything was perfect, not because there was no more difficulty ahead. There was always difficulty ahead. That was what ahead meant. Not because the work was finished. The work was never finished. That was what made it worth doing. But because he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was supposed to do with exactly the people he was supposed to be doing it with. He picked up his fork. He ate his dinner. Outside the window, the June evening held its light, the way long evenings do, longer than you expect, generous with it, as if the day knows that what's happening inside the house is worth illuminating a little longer before dark finally comes. Daniel Hayes, single father, former Navy propulsion specialist, federal contractor, program director, technical advisor to a legislative reform that would protect people. He would never meet. Daniel Hayes ate his pasta with his children and said nothing else because nothing else needed saying. He had done the job right. He had signed his name to it. That was enough. That was in the end everything.